Okay. So I'm still in context, this background context. And the second thing is a lot shorter than the first thing. So the first thing was, remember, the post-war position, basically, of the geopolitical position of the world, roughly. The second thing is the legacy of colonialism in Vietnam. And what's important to know about this is that before America went to fight in Vietnam and why they fought and all those things, which we'll talk about, first, the French fought there. The French fought there because the French owned Vietnam as a colony. In the mid 19th century, the French moved over to Vietnam and they began to colonize it in a similar way to the way the British colonized South Asia, and the Dutch colonized the Philippines, and so on. I mean, a number of countries, a number of powers in the 19th century began to look for colonies that would provide them with raw materials and potential sources of free or cheap labor, people that they could basically beat up and push around and make them, so they could make money. Because colonialism was first and foremost a way of, it's complex, but it's one way of indicating that you're powerful. It's a way of expanding your empire, and it's also a way of making money. All right, so the French moved into Vietnam, and they began growing rubber. Eventually, they were going to start rubber plantations, and at the point that we got into the post-war world, so again in 1946 and 47, the French began to fight with Vietnam's freedom fighters, basically. And these forces, who were known as the Viet Minh, were rebels who had very old arms. They had arms, if they had guns at all, which they were massively undersupplied. They had guns from the World War I, and the French were using contemporary weapons. They were using they were using submachine guns, automatic weapons, up-to-date field artillery, planes, early helicopters. They had basically a contemporary, a modern army, a modernized, militarized, modern industrial army. And the Vietnamese did not. The Vietnamese had Enfield rifles and things that have been basically dropped on them during the various wars that they'd sort of been party to, sort of suffered because of being colonies, and so on. So after World War II, the Vietnamese went to the French and said, "We'd like you to leave." And the French were initially like, "Oh, yeah, we might leave." And then they were like, "No, we're not leaving." So the Vietnamese said, "All right, well, we're going to have a war. We're going to fight you." And the French were like, "Yeah, we're not. This is our colony. We own you." And so there was a fight for independence. And this is a war which we don't talk about for a number of reasons, partly because the Vietnamese won. And that didn't look good for Western democracies because here was a powerful Western democracy, French, who first of all weren't behaving well because they were saying to a colonized country, "We own you." So it was white people saying to people of color, "We own you." Well, that didn't look very good. That wasn't very forward thinking. This wasn't part of the New World Order that was supposed to be part of the United Nations, and that that didn't. What happened to all that independence and home rule and all that stuff? And second, what are you going to say when a bunch of people who are living in the jungle, who have been driven into the jungle by a massive industrialized military, with fighting with basically the minimal resources over a long period of time, over the course of about 8 years, win the war? Well, this was not a story we were told in the West, and it's still not a story we're eager to learn. Well, it's interesting now. Now people are interested in the way the French lost in Vietnam. And this is going to become very important for the American story in Vietnam, right? Okay. That's the second thing. The third thing is the domino theory. The domino theory is one of the things that, one of the most important things that shaped the way America treated Vietnam. And it is this, it's kind of boneheaded theory about geopolitics. So if we go back, let me go back here for a second to, there we go. Let me get out of here. Okay. Now, if you look, I'm going to move my, if you look over to my right, your left, you will see that there's North Vietnam and South Vietnam, and then there are these little countries. I'm just partly covering Cambodia. There's Cambodia. And then north of Cambodia, I'm not sure if this is recording my mouse, is Laos. And then Thailand, yeah, the mouse has disappeared. And then Malaysia, basically. The theory is that, and this was first proposed by President Harry Truman, who was the FDR's, Franklin Delano Roosevelt successor. And Truman and his State Department, which was really still Roosevelt's State Department, came up with the idea that if South Vietnam fell to the communists, then Laos, which is right beside South Vietnam, and Cambodia would also fall, and then so would Burma, then Burma, Myanmar now, Thailand, and Malaysia. And that would take down the whole of this whole green crescent of the Philippines, leading down to Borneo and Sumatra and so on. And the idea is very simply that one domino will fall. The way it was used, the reason the domino theory in many ways gained such traction was that it was easy to explain. It was a really smart piece of salesmanship on the part of these State Department boys, and they were boys. Was that, if you have a bunch of dominoes standing and you knock one over, the next one's going to fall, the next one's going to fall, and everybody's like, oh yeah, that just makes natural sense. Whether the analogy actually holds up that was not something that people wanted to talk about. They just liked the analogy. So the theory is that in order to preserve the non-communist South Vietnam, you were going to prevent the whole of Southeast Asia from becoming communist. So that is the sort of most important part. All right. And at this point, I will stop.